I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and this is The American Idea, where we discuss the ideas, people, and events that have made America what it is today. We believe that by understanding our history and our principles, we can better live up to the promise of the American founding and preserve our ongoing experiment in self-government. Welcome to The American Idea. I want to welcome everyone to this episode of The American Idea. Today we're in our series on the Declaration of Independence and its legacy, which is part of our consideration, of course, of America 250, the 250th anniversary of America, our founding principles, and what they have meant over the course of American history and what they mean for today. But today we're going to be focusing on something very specific, very particular, and very interesting, the writing of the Declaration of Independence, how it came to be, and what effect its writing had in the immediate moment of the American Revolution. I'm joined for that conversation by somebody who knows the answers to those questions, Dr. Cara Rogers Stevens. Many of you know Cara, of course. She is a guest host here on The American Idea, a terrific scholar of the American Revolutionary period, of Thomas Jefferson, and more broadly, the American founding. She teaches courses at Ashland University on the founding, on the American Revolution, on Thomas Jefferson. She teaches teaching American history seminars for the Ashbrook Center all around the country. She teaches in our Master of Arts in American History program. She's a good friend of mine, a great friend of the Ashbrook Center, a terrific person, and the better half of the Jason Stevens, Cara Stevens duo. And I have to point out, of course, her wonderful book, which has received wide acclaim, Thomas Jefferson and the Fight Against Slavery. Among other things, I've counted it's the finalist for the Washington Prize, one of the most important prizes in American historiography, winner of the Herb Storing Book Prize, finalist for the Center for Presidential History Book Prize, and finalist for the Journal of the American Revolution Book of the Year Award. Maybe the Nobel Prize is next, Cara.
One can only hope.
Thanks for taking the time to be with us, of course. What an interesting thing to think about, the writing of the Declaration of Independence. I think most people think about the words themselves, not how they came to be. And my mind is immediately drawn back to that ill-fated prophecy of John Adams, one of the great American founders, who said that July 2nd would forever be the moment when we remember American independence and the beginning of the country. That's not true. That's not how it worked out.
Poor John Adams. First of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's always a pleasure to get to speak with you about any topic, but particularly when we get to talk about the founding. So John Adams wrote a letter to his wife, and he said, it was July the 3rd, and he said to her, "Abigail, you'll never guess what. Congress has voted to adopt Lee's resolution for independence." So there'd been a resolution proposed earlier in the summer about whether or not the colonies should declare independence. And on July the 2nd, the Congress voted, yes, we are going to declare independence. And so John Adams said this date should be celebrated with, and I'm going to quote him here, he said it should be celebrated with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore. And of course, that's not the day that we celebrate in the end. No,
he got the festivities right, but he got the date wrong.
He did. Interestingly, Americans chose not to celebrate the day that we voted to become independent. What we decided to celebrate the day that we adopted the document that had been primarily drafted by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence. So the day that we accepted that draft, the text, is our Independence Day.
Let's talk about that draft. How does the Declaration of Independence actually come to be?
So if we cast our minds back to Philadelphia in the spring of 1776, and at this point, one of the most popular books in America, or rather a pamphlet, second only to the Bible, is Thomas Paine's Common Sense. This has been circulating since January of 1776, and it's been making the argument that it's not enough for Americans just to push back against British overreach, British imperial power abuses, but that it actually makes zero sense for America to remain part of the British Empire. And there's some fascinating arguments in Common Sense. One of the best ones, I think, is the part where Thomas Paine says, "For all men being originally equals, no one by birth could have a right to set up his own family in perpetual preference to all others forever." So he's making this argument for the equality of mankind and really the strong case against hereditary monarchy. And he ends by saying, if nature wanted us to have hereditary kings, she wouldn't so frequently ridicule the institution of monarchy by giving mankind, and I'm quoting Thomas Paine here, an ass for a lion. In other words, sometimes the king is an idiot. Why would nature give us idiotic kings if nature wanted us to have these hereditary monarchs? He also argues that it doesn't make any sense for a small island to govern a massive continent. So Americans in general have started to rally behind this idea of independence. And the colonies have been debating in their different legislatures a declaration of independence throughout the spring of 1776. By May the 15th, Virginia instructs its delegates to Congress, go ahead and submit a resolution for declaring independence. So Richard Henry Lee does that. June the 7th, 1776, says, "Resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states." Now, Congress did not immediately accept his resolution. They won't do that until July the 2nd. But what they do right away is they create a committee of 5 men that are assigned to draft a document of independence. And the point of this document is to justify and to explain the colonies' decision to separate, to declare themselves an independent nation.
How do we get those 5? Who were those 5 particular people, that committee of 5 who are tasked with writing the draft of the Declaration of Independence? Who were they and how did they get selected?
Yeah. So the 5 men are John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert Livingston of New York. And what our listeners might notice is that there's a geographic variety among those 5 individuals, and that's probably one of the reasons why they were each chosen for this committee. The committee was not just going to represent the point of view of one part of the colonies, but it was designed to represent the people as a whole. You will notice that only one of those states is Southern. That's Thomas Jefferson from Virginia. And it was very important that a Southerner, and particularly a Virginian, be on this committee, since Virginia was the largest, most wealthy, and had a lot of sway in the Continental Congress. So it mattered that Thomas Jefferson be there, even though he was very young, kind of a junior member, only 33 years old at the time.
Yeah, I was wondering about Jefferson, because, of course, Jefferson's life and career and thought extremely well. At the time, he's not Thomas Jefferson, the way we think of Thomas Jefferson as a towering figure ever since.
Right.
Why was a person like Jefferson from such a prominent state as Virginia, why Jefferson?
So Jefferson, one reason that he was appointed, we believe, is because everybody knew that he was a good writer. So you're right, he didn't have a reputation as the Jefferson yet, but it was known that he was the author of the Summary Rights of British America, which was published anonymously in pamphlet form months and months prior to this, but people by this point knew that Jefferson was the author of that document, which very eloquently laid out the Americans' grievances with England. So partly it's his reputation as an excellent writer. Partly he had the time to be on this committee. Other members of this committee were far busier than he was. John Adams was taking committee meetings until 10 o'clock at night in his private quarters, just to cram in as much work as he possibly could. So Jefferson had the time. There's also a fascinating debate over why it was that Thomas Jefferson is the member of this committee who was actually given the task of doing the drafting of the document. And Jefferson and Adams publicly disagreed about this many years later. So 1822, Adams remembered that he was responsible for getting Jefferson to write the rough draft version of the Declaration of Independence. So here's John Adams. I'm quoting him again because it's too good not to quote. He said, I wrote to Thomas Jefferson, and here's the reasons that I gave him why he should be the author. Reason first, you are a Virginian, and Virginia ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can. And according to John Adams, Jefferson said, okay, I will do as well as I can. And I love this because this is typical Adams. He's very blunt. He's maybe misremembering this.
Okay.
But the reasons that he gives are, I love the self-deprecation here. He remembers that he was unpopular, he was obnoxious, he was suspected. Jefferson was quiet. He wasn't loudly asserting himself in different committee meetings or when the Congress met as a whole. So it was a less controversial choice, but also the fact that he was from Virginia and that he was such a good writer. Now, Jefferson remembered this a bit differently. He responded to Adams' memories by saying, well, in some of the particulars, Mr. Adams' memory has led him into unquestionable error. Jefferson said, it wasn't just Mr. Adams that persuaded me to take on the drafting. In fact, it was the whole committee of 5 unanimously pressed upon myself alone to undertake the draft. So either way, Jefferson gets the job and starts working on this draft. It takes him 17 days to work on this, and he does it mostly in his little lodging right on the edge of Philadelphia, across from a stable. So it's the middle of summer by this point. There's no air conditioning. It's hot. There's flies. There's the smell of manure. And he's laboring away at his little travel writing desk, working on this little Declaration of Independence.
I think some people wonder, did he had come all the way from Virginia to Philadelphia. When he's writing on the draft of the Declaration there in his place, does he have books with him? Does he have other pamphlets with him? Does he have other documents? Like, what is informing him as he's writing?
Jefferson would later say that he wasn't copying from any particular document, that he was really kind of capturing the sentiments that were in the air. They were just everywhere. But we do know that he did have a copy of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which had been recently written by George Mason. And there's very similar language in the Virginia Declaration of Rights. That could have been an influence. We also know that Jefferson had recently drafted his own version of a constitution for Virginia. And the preamble to that constitution had a list of grievances against the king. So there are definitely documents that he would have either recently read or had with him as he was doing the work. But again, Jefferson tells us that he wasn't copying and pasting. He was doing original writing here as he was working on the Declaration.
So he's working on it, as you said, for 17 days there in Philadelphia in the summer. He presents it to the Committee of 5, I'm assuming, and then the Committee of 5 has a conversation about it. What, if anything, do we know about the reaction in the Committee of 5 and what happened there?
Yeah. So far as we know, the Committee of 5 didn't necessarily have multiple meetings to debate this draft. What we do know is that Jefferson sent the draft specifically to John Adams and to Benjamin Franklin for their comments, and that the draft underwent a few minor changes as a result of Franklin and Adams's comments. So, for example, we know that the phrase pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism. Despotism is Franklin's contribution. Originally, Jefferson had the word power there. So we know that Franklin made maybe 4 or 5 suggestions. Franklin's suggestions tended to be changing the wording to make it a little bit more precise, maybe reducing the word count a little bit. So he was being a good editor, kind of tightening the language a little bit. There's a debate over whether or not the phrase self-evident We hold these truths to be self-evident, whether that was a Franklin edition. Originally, Jefferson's first version had the phrase sacred and undeniable. So some people believe that Franklin changed the wording. Others say no, that the change is in Jefferson's handwriting, so we don't know for sure. Regardless, Franklin makes a few suggestions. Adams makes a few suggestions. At the time, Franklin was having an attack of gout. His big toe was incredibly painful, so he wasn't coming down to Philadelphia on a daily basis because he was in so much pain. But he made these suggestions from a distance. And then we think that the other two members of the committee didn't have as much of a contribution at this stage. They did read it, but Jefferson's draft was pretty untouched by the time it goes from the Committee of Five to the full congressional hearing of this. And that happens on July 2nd, and mostly on July the 3rd and July 4th. That's when Congress debates the draft that has been produced by Jefferson and the Committee of Five.
Before we continue with our conversation, I'd like to have one of our faculty members tell you about a special documents-based graduate program for teachers of American history, government, and civics.
Hi, this is John Moser, Chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program at Ashland University. If you are an educator who teaches U.S. history, government, or politics, our program may be just what you've been looking for. Our approach is to emphasize primary sources, since we think the best way to study the past is to read the words of those who lived it. We have a distinguished faculty made up of professors from both Ashland University and from colleges and universities across the country. And they're not there to lecture to you. We think it's better to learn through conversation about the documents. Ours is a hybrid program with two different types of seminar. The first are our week-long intensive in-person courses during the summers on the beautiful campus of Ashland University. The second are our live synchronous online seminars offered throughout the year. So if you're a social studies teacher and you're looking to deepen your understanding of America's past and its politics, please check out the Master of Arts in American History and Government program. You can do that by visiting tah.org/programs.
I'm fascinated by that moment when Congress has assigned these folks to create the draft. They have now created the draft. They bring it back to Congress. You wonder how the document's going to fare when it gets to this much larger body of people from all across the colonies.
Yeah. I just discovered this great story that Jefferson told later on in life. He said, as Congress was debating his draft, and they cut about 25% of his draft. So
wow, okay.
Jefferson is sitting there kind of dying 1,000 deaths as he's listening to his words being, in his term was mutilated. He believed Congress mutilated his beautifully crafted document. And he was sitting next to Benjamin Franklin. So Mr. Franklin was apparently there on that day. And Franklin saw that Jefferson was in agony. And so Franklin told Jefferson a story to try to make him feel better about a friend of Franklin's who wanted to open a business where he sold hats. And he hung a sign outside of his shop that he wanted it to have his name and a picture of a hat. And then it would have said something like, John Thompson, maker of hats, will sell for ready money. And he passed this idea to a few of his friends before he paid the money to have the sign made. And by the time the friends were done editing his little advertisement, all that was left was his name and a picture of a hat. And I think Franklin was trying to make Jefferson feel better that anytime that you submit your work to a committee of your friends, they're going to cut it down quite substantially. It's not just personal attack against Jefferson. Well, so
what kind of things got cut? What was the debate like?
Yeah. So the biggest change that was made, the largest chunk of text that was deleted was an entire paragraph that came at the end of the list of charges against King George. So the final one of the grievances against the king is a grievance having to do with the slave trade. And in this paragraph, Jefferson points out that there had been attempts in the colonies to ban the slave trade into the colonies and that the king had vetoed those attempts. And Jefferson turns this into a very profound indictment of slavery itself. So he says slavery is cruel war against human nature itself. He calls it a violation of the sacred rights of life life and liberty of the African peoples. He specifically points out the miserable death that occurs during the slave trade at the transportation across the Atlantic Ocean. He refers to the trade as piratical warfare, and he really indicts the king for being, so-called Christian king of Great Britain, but he's engaging in warfare that really the Europeans looked down upon when it was practiced against them by Islamic powers. So why should the Christian king be doing this? And the most profound moment in this paragraph is when Jefferson says that the king is determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. And Jefferson emphasized that word, men. Nowadays, of course, Americans frequently debate, did the Declaration of Independence, with its beautiful statement of equality, liberty, equal rights, did this apply to all people, or did it only apply to white males, the people who were free and capable of voting at the time of the Continental Congress? And I think that this paragraph gives us a great glimpse into Thomas Jefferson's mindset and the mindset of many other members of the Continental Congress, that when they used that word men, they were not referring to white males. Here, Jefferson is using that word men to refer to slave markets where Black men, Black women, and Black children are being bought and sold. And he's calling out the violations of their human rights, their sacred rights of life and liberty. So for Jefferson, men is a word that is synonymous with mankind. And slavery is very clearly wrong. Equality of rights belongs to all humans. Now, the question is, why did Congress cut this paragraph?
Right.
Jefferson and Adams agreed in their later recollections about why this paragraph was cut. Both Jefferson and Adams said the reason why it was deleted was because the southern states, in particular South Carolina and Georgia, wanted to continue the slave trade. So they didn't want to have this paragraph. It would have seemed very hypocritical to call out the King of England for vetoing their bills, but then also they wanted to keep the slave trade going themselves. And Jefferson also said there were some Northern congressmen who opposed the paragraph because even though they didn't own a lot of slaves themselves, they were heavily invested in the slave trade themselves. So that's why the paragraph is deleted, because the point of the Declaration of Independence, although it does make these assertions of equality that will be used to end the slave trade eventually and to end slavery eventually, the moment was not yet right to try to unify all of the colonial representatives to oppose slavery right then. What they needed to do first was just to accomplish a declaration of independence and a victory against Great Britain. So that's what the deleted paragraph tells us about that moment in time.
When Congress saw that draft, and even after they're debating and cutting 25% of it, do we know anything about whether the draft itself helped to galvanize people in the room for, okay, now we're really going to do independence. We're really going to, the war has changed from a war of resistance to a war of independence, a real revolution. Or did they react and sort of say, whoa, wait a minute, what's all this? What do we know anything about the effect that draft had on the delegates in the Second Continental Congress?
This is kind of crossing the Rubicon in a way. So where previously Americans were appealing to the king and arguing that the Parliament was treating Americans unfairly, but hoping that the king would still intervene on their behalf, the Declaration of Independence very clearly calls out King George III himself. And it makes the case that the Americans are not traitors or rebels who deserve to be outside the bounds of international law, the way that King George might classify them. But it makes the case that this is now an independent nation deserving of recognition from the international community. And were the Americans to lose the American Revolution, of course, we know that there would have been grave repercussions from the victors from England toward the different signers of this declaration, as indeed many of the signers of the declaration did suffer greatly if they were captured by the English or as a result of kind of giving up their careers to be part of this revolutionary process. So I think this is a very solemn moment in the history of the nation, that the people who wrote and who signed this declaration knew that there was no turning back from this moment.
In the course of the debates, you mentioned that Congress cut a sizable percentage. Is there anything that they added? Do we know of anything that was added that was noteworthy or important?
Yeah, there are a few phrases that that are worth noting. In particular, the final paragraph has two references to God as a result of the Congress's debate. So the phrase "appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions" was added, and so was the phrase "with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence." So those invocations of God, perhaps not what Jefferson would have inserted if he had been left to his own devices. It changed the character of the document slightly. Jefferson wasn't opposed to appealing to God, but perhaps he wouldn't have done it as many times.
I see. So then it's voted on July 4th, after there's debate on July 3rd and July 4th. Additions, subtractions are made, additions are inserted. There's a vote. Was the vote unanimous? What do we know about the vote?
It wasn't unanimous yet. So New York did not yet have permission from its state legislature to vote for independence. And so they abstained. The delegates from New York abstained. And so the unanimous declaration of these United States that you would find at the top of any printing today of the Declaration of Independence, that wasn't there yet. In the very first printing of the Declaration of Independence, which occurred on July the 5th in Philadelphia, John Dunlap printed about 200 broadside copies of the Declaration. They did not have that word unanimous on the top because it wasn't yet, but that word would be added later as soon as New York was given permission to release its delegates to vote for independence.
And so all the delegates in the Second Continental Congress, of course, they're voting by state, as you said. Were there any, do we know from correspondence or anything else, who just were really reluctant to vote in favor of this declaration or didn't or wouldn't do so?
There were people who were reluctant, indeed. And if you look at the eventual signers of the Declaration, we know that not every delegate to Congress signed the document. So there were 200 copies that were printed right away, and then the document was officially embossed or kind of handwritten by Timothy Matlack. And that beautiful embossed version was signed on August the 2nd, first by John Hancock, of course, we all know. And then eventually 56 delegates signed the Declaration, but several of them never did. They had maybe reservations about this document. So it wasn't unanimous even amongst the delegation members, but eventually all of the states did unanimously decide to declare independence.
Then, of course, as you say, 200 copies are made, presumably across the city of Philadelphia. It starts to spread. I'm really interested to know what the effect of the Declaration is in these first years that it comes out, the effect on the course of the Revolution, the effect on the American people. For example, did people know that there had been a Declaration of Independence? Did they read it? Were they aware of it, what it said?
Yeah.
And maybe how it shaped the course of public life in that early part of the Revolution.
You know, one of the things that's remarkable about America and the American Revolution is that the Americans were such a literate people, extraordinarily literate for that day and age. And so the fact that this document was printed and then distributed widely, it was reprinted in colonial newspapers. These broadside copies were also meant to be read aloud, and they spread rapidly across the colonies. So people could either read it themselves or it was read to them. It was read on the steps of public houses. George Washington had it read to the troops almost immediately, and that was one of the very powerful uses of the Declaration, that this was meant to be a document that unified these disparate colonies, and that all they had in common, some of them, was that they happened to be on the same body of land and have the same history with England. So now there's common cause and common ideals, common principles uniting these colonies, and uniting the soldiers who are fighting on behalf of the different varied colonies. So it's extremely important use of the Declaration is that right away, those words are spreading across the 13 colonies and they're unifying people. These words are not just remaining in America either. They spread to England just about right away.
I was wondering about that. What's the British reception when they get this document and read this?
Yeah, it's in England by August. And the reception there, of course, as you might imagine, is mixed. There's some English people who are supporters of the American Revolution. Others are scandalized, horrified, offended, the nerve of these colonials. But the document doesn't just stay in England. It was printed in Spain, in the Netherlands, in Austria by the end of August. It's translated into multiple other languages. And it has another one of its intended effects, which is to proclaim to the nations of the world the common sense of America becoming its own nation, declaring independence, and being worthy of international recognition, and financial and military support starts to come. And that's one of the key goals of this document, and it's achieved. So France, of course, coming over and supporting the United States in their fight against England. That's crucial. What good is declaring independence if you can't back that up with military might in order to actually effect the victories that are necessary to live out your independence? And we needed France in order for that to happen.
Looking back later in life, of course, the principal author, Thomas Jefferson, what does he have to tell us? What does he think about the Declaration, about its writing and about its creation and its significance?
There are two letters that Jefferson wrote toward the end of his life where he very beautifully discusses the Declaration and its impact. So one of them is a letter to Henry Lee in 1825. And in this letter, Jefferson is dealing with maybe some jealousy or some controversy that had occurred about whether or not Jefferson stole portions of this document or plagiarized portions of this document. Did he really deserve credit for being the author of the Declaration of Independence? And Jefferson said, the object of the Declaration of Independence was not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject. I love there that he reaches back to Tom Paine's common sense. In terms so plain and firm as to command their assent and to justify ourselves in the independent stand we are compelled to take, neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment, nor yet copied from any particular and previous writing, it was intended to be an expression of the American mind. So he wasn't claiming to have come up with something totally new, but he also wasn't copying anything particular from previous documents. He was giving voice to the sentiments that were held in common by very many Americans. And he says its authority rests on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversation, in letters, printed essays, or the elementary books of public rights, such as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc. So Jefferson recognizes there are ancient sources from which some of these political ideas come. There are Enlightenment sources. There are religious sources. There are also just common sense reasons why America needed to declare independence in 1776. And his genius was bringing all of those together, creating a unified document that makes the case for American independence so eloquently and so simply that it is still powerful today. And Jefferson, his second really important letter on this topic is a letter that he wrote to the mayor of Washington, D.C., Roger Waitman, right before his own death in 1826. Jefferson was invited to a 50th anniversary celebration for the birthday of America, for a July 4th celebration. And he was too ill to attend, but he wrote a letter to the mayor explaining that he could not attend and then saying that he hoped that the Declaration would be to the world what I believe it will be, to some parts sooner, to others later, but finally to all, the signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves and to assume the blessings and security of self-government. He continues by saying, all eyes are opened or opening to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth. The mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few, booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. What's really profound to me about this letter is that here again we get an answer to the question, who did the Declaration of Independence apply to? When Jefferson said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, did he mean white males? Well, this letter that he wrote many years after the Declaration tells us very clearly Jefferson didn't just want Europeans to realize that they were created equal and that they had the right to consent to their government.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The American Idea.
Light, this knowledge to spread throughout the entire world, to Africa, to Asia, to South America. He rejoiced to see that there were already, by the 1820s, other nations with brown-skinned peoples who were having their own revolutions and instituting rights and independent documents. I think he would be very pleased to know that more than 100 nations of the world now have a Declaration of Independence of their own. Not all of them embrace the idea of natural rights, but certainly the idea of government by the consent of the governed is far more widely popular now than it was before 1776. And the Declaration of Independence has had a massive impact globally in articulating these concepts of rights and of consent to government.
What a fascinating, inspiring, and interesting writing of the Declaration of Independence, how it happened, what effect it has, and what it's still, I think, if you're right, continuing to have on America and the rest of the world. Cara Rogers Stevens, thanks for taking the time to join us for this really interesting and enlightening conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.